77 years ago today, as of when this video comes out, Newfoundland became the 10th province of Canada. At the time, more Newfoundlanders probably would have preferred to become the 49th state of the United States. And 16 years before that, Newfoundland had been an independent country. It was the first effectively independent British colony to lose its independence and return to colonial status. So how did this happen? How did Newfoundland lose its independence, and why did it join Canada instead of joining the United States or returning to independence? Well, so I had sort of been familiar with the story, and the reason I actually looked into this more was because with the whole Trump-Greenland thing, I was joking, nobody should tell him about Newfoundland, or maybe they should if they wanted to distract him from Greenland when he's focused on Canada anyways. But what I'd heard was basically the Newfoundlanders wanted to join the United States, or more Newfoundlanders wanted to join the United States than wanted to join Canada. But the British wouldn't let them put that option on the ballot, and they were afraid that if they voted for independence, the Catholics would take over the country and turn it into a quasi-theocracy like Eamon de Valera had done in Ireland. And so they ended up voting for Canada just to avoid a Catholic takeover, stopping them from joining the United States. And so that was basically my understanding. But then with the Greenland thing, I'm like, I should actually look into this. And I had actually bought this book because I'm interested in the history of Atlantic Canada. And so I have a number of books on that topic. And I bought this a bit ago. Actually, it might have been the previous time Trump was talking about Greenland. But I finally decided to read about it. And so basically there are three sort of ideas in this book that the author puts forward that I think are interesting and I want to talk about. And then I'm going to also talk about what I think might have happened if Newfoundland had either regained independence or joined the United States. Would it have been better off? And the short answer, if you don't want to watch to the end, is I think it almost certainly would have been better off as an independent country. I think it probably would have been better off as a U.S. state, at least based on the terms which it joined Canada in this treaty. But there's a lot of reasons that it potentially might not have been, and I will talk about those. However, I want to talk about what's in this book first, which is, again, so basically three sort of big contentions the author makes. And he didn't do this research. There was someone else who did the research. What was his name again? Okay, so James Hawley was the guy who did the research for this book, and then the author, Greg Malone, put it all together because Hawley, basically, it was not quite his dying wish, but he's asked him to write the book that he had spent his life researching. And so basically, there are sort of, I would say, three essential claims in this book, which are, first of all, that Britain forced Newfoundland to give up its independence under terms that were, frankly, unreasonable and hypocritical. Secondly, that once Newfoundland gave up its independence, Britain ignored the guarantees under which it had given up its independence. And thirdly, that Britain forced Newfoundland to join Canada, basically partly as an agreement for Canada to forgive the British World War II debt, and partially because Britain didn't want to see Newfoundland join the United States. And then the third thing is, he says that there's significant evidence, or substantial evidence, although circumstantial, that the British didn't just put their thumb on the scale hard to make the Newfoundlanders join Canada, because he goes into a lot of detail on this, but also that they actually might have rigged the vote. Like, they knew they were going to lose, especially after the first round of voting when they lost that. And so they actually engaged in throwing away ballots for independence and stuffing ballots for joining Canada. So I won't go too much detail into the evidence for this, but I do want to talk about the motivations and what happened. So Newfoundland, the story I had always learned is that Newfoundland had racked up an irresponsible amount of debt after the First World War, and they asked Britain to be taken back as a colony so that they didn't have to pay that debt off. And I read a book review in The Economist like a decade or two ago, claiming that they racked up this war debt partly because of the First World War, and they also were economically unviable because of how many Newfoundland men had died fighting in the First World War. So for the First World War, it basically made Australia and New Zealand as independent nations with the whole Gallipoli thing with the deaths there. But it destroyed Newfoundland because they didn't have enough young men to be economically viable. And so one thing that becomes clear in this book is that Newfoundland was economically viable. They had a lot of debt in the Great Depression that they were struggling to pay, and they asked to renegotiate the debt on the same terms that Britain had just renegotiated their debt. So it was 4% interest. Britain negotiated it down to 3%. Newfoundland wanted to negotiate it down to 3%. The point is, Britain wouldn't let Newfoundland do what they had done themselves, but once they took the country over, they immediately renegotiated that debt back down, and they didn't actually invest much money in Newfoundland. Like, I had always learned it was Newfoundland asked to be taken back to be subsidized by the British, but the British were actually not really subsidizing Newfoundland much the whole time they had taken it over. And it was questionable, like a lot of British people questioned the motivations even at the time. But the reason that Britain was pushing for this is because transatlantic aviation had become viable, and Newfoundland was an important point for that, and Britain wanted to have control over that. And then once transatlantic aviation got better in the Second World War, Britain really didn't need Newfoundland for that anymore. And they were worried about Newfoundland possibly joining the US, so they pushed Newfoundland to join Canada while also getting Canada to forgive the British war debt. But initially, they wanted to hold on to Newfoundland, and there were even talks of making a United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and Newfoundland, which is... So I'm interested in alternate history, and one thing I've discovered is that every idea I've come up with, pretty much, no matter how weird, I can find someone who proposed it, and this one was apparently proposed by several British people seriously, because that was something that I wondered. Like, I knew Newfoundland was Britain's oldest colony, closely linked to them, and I'm like, I wonder why, if they didn't want to join Canada, no one proposed ever having them join the United Kingdom, and apparently people did, but it never got off the ground, and it would not have been very popular with the Newfoundlanders, at least according to Greg Malone. And so then in World War II, it became important to British and American military operations, and the British actually told the Americans to spend less money because it was making the British and Canadians look bad. And the Newfoundlanders wanted to join the US. The US was like, yeah, sure, maybe, didn't really care. Canada wanted Newfoundland to join Canada, but they were really obsessed with getting Labrador, which was strategically important and very mineral rich. So while Britain was in control of Newfoundland, they actually signed over a bunch of aviation and mineral rights in Labrador to Canada. And then after the Second World War, so Newfoundland gave up its independence, and the agreement was that once it was economically viable again, once it could pay its own debts, Newfoundland would become self-governing again under the same terms as before. But it became economically viable as early as in the Second World War, possibly earlier, but definitely in the Second World War. And Britain was like, well, there's a war on, we'll wait until after. And then after the war, it was still economically viable, but the British just kept putting that off while they were trying to figure out, can we either make it part of the UK or give it to Canada and get something out of it? And so then a lot of this book is about the shenanigans of the British. So you'll hear a lot of people talking about election in other countries as the elections were technically free but not fair. And most of this book is talking about sort of what the British were doing to make that happen. And one thing is the Newfoundlanders were very, very anti-joining Canada. But Joey Smallwood, who became the first premier of Newfoundland when it was part of Canada, basically a lot of Newfoundlanders were interested in joining the US. And so he proposed, why don't we tell Britain we'll have a three-way vote between Newfoundland independence, joining Canada, and joining the US, knowing that Britain would veto the US option, but then that would get Canada on the ballot. So that was one of the many shenanigans to get it on the ballot. And then there was a two-round election, and independence won, but it didn't quite win a majority. But it was clear, like, the way the votes were going, because there was a third option, which was keeping... So there were three options, which were keep the Commission of Government, join Canada, or independence. And the Commission of Government got very few votes. Independence was clearly ahead, and it was clear that the Commission of Government people, enough of them would... Even if it was not, like, two-thirds of them voted for Canada, it would still... Newfoundland independence, forget exactly. But then it ended up being the case that Newfoundland did, at least on paper, vote to join Canada. And in the last part of the book, he has a few pieces of circumstantial evidence that the British actually rigged that election. And that was something when I was a kid. I used to be skeptical about how common this was outside of, like, city machine politics, but I realized, no, this was actually something like democracies do all the time, so it's very possible. But even if the British didn't rig it, it was still... That makes it free but not fair, which is something that we criticize in other countries. And so Newfoundland became part of Canada on terms that were very unfavorable to Newfoundland, and the Canadians insisted on negotiating with the... Well, it wasn't even a negotiation. The Canadians just set terms and had the Newfoundlanders... It was sort of like Brexit, where the terms were not defined, and a lot of promises were made that were not kept. But So the question is, so he says, it's probably better that the Newfoundlanders join Canada than the US because Newfoundland values align more with Canadian values. But the way he describes the values of Newfoundland and the economy at the time, and Newfoundland economy was pretty heavily linked to New England, like the values of Newfoundland sound more like what I would think of as American values than what Canadians present as Canadian values. And so I suspect part of that feeling is loss aversion. But now Newfoundland is obviously much more heavily linked to Canada than the US because so many Newfoundlanders go and work in the Alberta oil fields. And so as I sort of teased at the beginning, I think Newfoundland almost certainly would have been better off as an independent country. And I wrote a song about that to the tune of Banks of Newfoundland. Well, it's actually titled Banks of Newfoundland, but with the number matching the dictionary definition of financial banks. Forget which one that was. And I'll see if I can find that. I didn't email that one, I don't think, so I might not have it. But basically a song representing an alternate history where Newfoundland stays independent and becomes an offshore banking center. Because one thing I knew about Newfoundland history is that the economy became really unviable after the cod fisheries collapsed. And I had assumed, well, if Newfoundland was an independent country, that would probably happen sooner. But it turns out, according to this book, Canada basically sold the Newfoundland cod fishery rights to Europeans that the Newfoundlanders had resisted doing. So they might actually have been more sustainable under an independent Newfoundland. But even if they hadn't, small countries tend to be better governed, more representative, and more prosperous as long as they are not under threat from larger neighbors. And I might get into this in future videos. It's a phenomenon I've noticed. It's a phenomenon that comedian and commentator Andrew Heaton has speculated on. Like, does this happen? I'm like, yeah, it definitely happens. Like, I've seen enough that I am pretty convinced it's the case, and I have thoughts on why. But so let's say that for whatever reason, either the British didn't put so much pressure or the Newfoundlanders were strongly enough against joining Canada that they became independent. And they were saying, okay, well, we can't actually make independence work, so we're going to join Canada or the US. Would they have been better off in the US or in Canada? So ask Puerto Rico about that. And I will say, it would look cool on a map if both Newfoundland and Puerto Rico were states, because then we'd have the... So I'm going to do this facing you, so it would be... You'd have Alaska and Hawaii and then Newfoundland and Puerto Rico, right? And that would look kind of cool, but we still don't have Puerto Rico as a state. And if you know about Puerto Rico history, first of all, Puerto Rico had no federal income tax and a lot of tax incentives for companies to relocate there. Then Congress did away with that in the early 2000s, and Puerto Rico became financially unviable. However, Congress would not let Puerto Rico had less authority to renegotiate its own debt than American towns do, much less states. And Congress, I was reminded as I was reading his account of the British not letting Newfoundland renegotiate its debt, I'm like, oh, this sounds familiar. This sounds like what happened with Puerto Rico in the US in the 2010s. However, Newfoundland would have been a state probably, right? It would not have been a territory like Puerto Rico, but it would still have dealt with the Jones Act, which... I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. There's a lot of people who've explained basically the Merchant Marine Act requires that all cargo between U.S. ports be built on U.S.-built, U.S.-owned, and U.S.-crewed ships. And it's supposed to preserve the U.S. maritime shipbuilding industry. The U.S. maritime shipbuilding industry has basically stopped existing, and it dramatically increases prices for Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico. But the defenders will say, oh, these libertarian nutjobs don't understand that it's important to preserve U.S. national defense by keeping a shipbuilding industry. And it's like, what shipbuilding industry? The Jones Act has kept the U.S. river shipping industry in business, or the shipbuilding industry for riverboats in business, at the cost of making internal U.S. We have some of the best internal waterways in the world, and we use highways where we could use them because the Jones Act has made that more expensive. But it has at least kept the internal river shipbuilding industry in business. I don't know how useful that's going to be for defense, but there is no maritime shipbuilding industry anymore, and yet the same people will go, oh, you libertarian nutjobs who don't understand the importance of national defense. Anyways, so as a libertarian nutjob, I have a chip on my shoulder about the Jones Act, but it makes things way more expensive for Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, because you can't have like a ship coming from China stop off at Hawaii and then stop off at another U.S. port. So stuff is shipped to California and then back to Hawaii generally. And with Puerto Rico, same thing. Like, you can't come from South America or Europe, stop off at Puerto Rico and then Miami. So it's generally shipped in from Miami. And Alaska, I think same thing with Seattle. Although in Alaska, at least, there is a highway that goes through Canada, so you can get some goods there through truck. But it's a lot cheaper to transport things on water than truck. So the Jones Act would have affected Newfoundland and would have been bad for Newfoundland. However, if you look at the economy of Canada and the US, because the Canadians will talk about, okay, we have better social services or better funded social services. And okay, maybe, but the way Canada operates, both with that, but also Canada, believe it or not, is actually a more federalist country. Provinces have more autonomy than states in the US do. And I had a constitutional law teacher who argued that basically America was trying to be federalist and give states autonomy. So they said the states get any power the federal government doesn't have. And so then the federal government started expanding its power and clawing more power from the states. The British wanted Canada to be a unitary country. So they said the federal government gets anything the provinces don't have. And the provinces began expanding their power and clawing power away from the Canadian federal government. And you're seeing even more of that now with what Quebec has been up to. And so I've heard that in some ways there is less free trade between Canadian provinces than between the countries of the European Union. And so if you look at, I've seen various maps trying to estimate like median income and GDP per capita in US states versus Canadian provinces. And I've seen some that estimate that Ontario, which is the most populous and historically wealthiest Canadian province, is poorer than Mississippi, the poorest US state. And by that metric, like Alaska and even Hawaii are still more affluent than Canadian provinces. And of course, Hawaii has a huge like housing cost crisis, like even beyond most of the mainland US. More native Hawaiians now live in the mainland US than live in Hawaii because they can't afford that. But Canada also has a much worse affordability crisis than the US. And you have a lot of Canadians. I couldn't find the numbers because when I was trying to find them, I was finding numbers that were very apples to oranges that suggested there are more Americans of Canadian descent than there are Americans living in Canada. And I'm like, that's very different numbers. But I certainly had the impression, like I have not met any Americans who moved to Canada. Although, I suppose would it be more likely that I'd know an American who moved to Canada than I know about it? Probably not. But I've met plenty of Canadians who moved to the US. And so my intuition is probably, even with the Jones Act, Newfoundland would have been in a better position. And one thing is, basically Canada negotiated to get the aviation rights and mineral rights of Newfoundland, and the US just takes the aviation rights of our states. But there is the equal footing doctrine, which says that all states have to be admitted on equal footing, so Newfoundland would have kept its own mineral rights in Labrador. So I don't know. I think it's likely Newfoundland would have been better off in the US than in Canada, but certainly the Jones Act would not have helped things. But the reason this story was interesting to me is because this was a democratic country, Great Britain, taking away democratic autonomy from the self-governing colony of Newfoundland, which had been self-governing for basically a century at this point, on very protectual, hypocritical reasons in order to control the Newfoundland strategically, and then they used it as a bargaining chip with Canada against the wishes of the Newfoundland population. And so it's an interesting story, and when I read it, I'm like, oh, the date of Newfoundland joining Canada is coming up in like a couple months. I should make a video for that. So I wanted to tell that story and my thoughts on, again, we won't know for sure. In my intuition, probably Newfoundland would have been best off as an independent country, second best under the US, third best if they had been able to negotiate as an independent country with Canada and kept mineral rights, and if they could keep aviation rights. I don't know if the Canadian Constitution allows that. And obviously what actually happened was basically the worst case scenario for them. So it was an interesting story. Wanted to talk about it. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.